All right, good afternoon. I apologize for the delay. Zoom updated to something called Zoom Workplace. So it decided to do all of its updates uh, as I logged in. And then when it went to its regular screens, everything's different as far as where things are. I couldn't even find the meeting. I had to go through a number of different little things. I found it in a small little corner, recurring meetings, and opened it up. So I'll get better at knowing this new stuff. And now all the stuff on the bottom is a little different also. So I am getting used to it. Confirming no class Thursday 7/4. Yeah, there's no class on July 4th ever. I'm never going to go to teach on July 4th. Yep, not even online. All right, so no class on Thursday. We won't have class again until Saturday. All right, let me go ahead and share the screen so you can see what I'm seeing. Make sure I share the sound, share, and open up our PowerPoints. What's the chat? All right. Thought I already did this, but I guess not. Cardiovascular. All right, so this should open up, and today we're going to discuss blood vessels, the avenues by which blood can move through the cardiovascular system. So still in our same chapter 26. Yes, we want to go to where we left off. And we get to talk about blood vessels. All right. So what are blood vessels? Blood vessels are a network of tubes, or if you will, a pipe system, where the largest pipes relate to the heart. And as blood goes away from the heart, the pipes get smaller and smaller and smaller as they branch from each other until the pipes are at their smallest, which is a network of very, very tiny microscopic blood vessels where they're only one cell layer thick, super, super thin, so that they're very permeable, so that exchange between the cells that are next to the capillaries and the bloodstream can occur. All right, so as we zoom in on the capillaries, I'll explain that a little bit more. But essentially, you've got arteries coming out of the heart. The big arteries become smaller arteries, become smaller arteries, become tiny arteries, become small little arterioles, and at the very end of the arterioles are the capillary beds. What's important to understand is that the blood stays in the blood vessels. The blood doesn't leave the blood vessels. Does a little bit of plasma leak out? Yes. Is there permeability where blood gases and ions and things of that sort can permeate across the membrane? Yes. But the blood cells stay in the blood vessels. At least the red blood cells do. If a blood cell were to find its way out of a blood vessel, it's going to die. But as long as the blood cell is inside the blood vessel, it stays alive for its lifespan. And if we're talking about red blood cells, we're talking 120 days at the most, usually 3 to 4 months. It's anywhere from 90 to 120 days, on average around 105 days for a red blood cell. But those cells stay in the bloodstream. Now, do white blood cells have the ability to escape the blood vessel? And absolutely, and I showed you that last time. White blood cells are designed to use the blood vessels as quick transport and then find their way out of the gaps in blood vessels to move between the tissue space and essentially protect the body from any pathogen assault. And then we've got platelets designed to patch up any breaks to blood vessels so that you can keep the blood in. So when we say the blood stays in the blood vessels, we're talking about the red blood cells. The red blood cells stay inside the blood vessels. So from the big arteries to the smaller arteries to the tiny arteries to the small arterioles and into the capillary bed, red blood cells stay inside those vessels. Once the red blood cell goes through the capillary, it's very likely that the oxygen that it was carrying was released into the tissue space, and now that red blood cell is working its way back toward the heart, from the capillaries into the small venules, into the bigger veins, into the even bigger veins, into the largest of veins, until the blood is back to the heart. So we talk about blood vessels, and we use the term vascular when describing vessels. And it doesn't matter if you say artery or vein. If it's vascular, it's one of the vessels. When you say it's arterial, then it's of the arteries, any form of arterio. If you say it's venous, it's part of the veins. So the mistake that most students make is that you get used to seeing arteries drawn red and veins drawn blue. So that means arteries have oxygen-rich blood and veins have oxygen-poor blood. And that's not a false statement. It's just not an entirely true statement, because even though arteries of the body carry oxygen-rich blood, delivering oxygen-rich blood to the tissues of the body, there are arteries that have oxygen-poor blood in them. Same thing with veins. Even though veins of the body are draining oxygen-deprived blood back to the heart, there are veins that deliver oxygen-rich blood. So the question is how can we talk about an artery with oxygen-poor blood or a vein with oxygen-rich blood when we look at these drawings and see arteries have oxygen-rich blood and veins have oxygen-poor blood? Well, I need to break you of this mindset that arteries carry oxygen-rich blood and veins carry oxygen-poor blood, because that's not why an artery is an artery or why a vein is a vein. An artery is an artery because it's built to endure the pressure of the squeezing heart. It's thicker, it's stronger, it's elastic, it's muscular, it's designed for pressure. It's designed to counteract pressure and encourage fast movement of blood to the tissues of the body. The veins are not thick. They are not muscular. They have muscle in them, but very thin muscle. They are not very elastic. They've got kind of a flimsiness to them. So how are arteries and veins different? Well, the main thing is the direction of blood flow. Arteries have blood flow always, always, always away from the heart. Veins have blood flow directionally always, always, always toward the heart. That's what makes arteries and veins different. Because when blood flow is going away from the heart, it's under pressure. And so those vessels have to be built to endure the pressure. Whereas venous return is directionally toward the heart, where pressure is getting less and less and less as blood gets closer to the heart. So the veins don't need to be built big, thick, strong, muscular, elastic. What the veins actually need to be built like is larger in overall open space, called the lumen, with valves on the inside every so often in the veins to prevent the wrong direction of backflow. Because when there's very little pressure in the venous return, any external pressure can push blood the wrong way, and we don't want blood going the wrong way. I saw this video of a bodybuilder, and he's showing his forearm, okay? He's like showing the veins on his forearm. And he takes his finger, and he puts his finger on one of the veins, and then he goes up along his arm, and it looks like the vein disappears. The vein didn't disappear. What happened is as he goes up his arm and then he comes back this direction, he created enough external pressure that no blood could get into the vein right here, and it simply collapsed. And then once he let go, it popped right back up as the blood flow returned inside of his superficial vein of his forearm. I'll see if I can find that video a little later so you can see what I mean as far as the very little pressure of veins, so that any external pressure can cause a stoppage of blood flow or even a potential push back the wrong way. The valves of the veins are designed to prevent that. Unfortunately, if there's too much back pressure on veins over time, those valves of the vein or veins plural that are in question, they become more and more incompetent, allowing the vein to become more tortuous and crooked and bulgy under all that back pressure. And we call those varicose veins. And I'll show you that as part of our pathology, because there are some people that are not really in the know of what varicose veins actually look like. They think that varicose veins are the little spidery looking outcroppings of blue vessels in the skin. which may or may not be related to varicosities, but true varicosities are just bulging, massively bulging, looks like snaky river veins just protruding through the skin. Other people don't know that the esophagus is another place to see venous varicosities, as well as the rectum. Hemorrhoids are actually varicose veins, protruding crooked veins that are bulging into the mucosa of the rectum, and usually seen both internal and external relative to the anus. So I'll even show you what hemorrhoids look like, even though they fall under the category of varicose veins. All right. First and foremost, let's talk about how a blood vessel is built. And then we'll talk about arteries and veins and differentiate them from each other. The way I like to show arteries and veins is I like to take two pieces of paper, one that's thicker, one that's thinner. So what I have is something that's more construction grade and one that's more like light. And then I like to take a magazine. And I've got a magazine right here. Give me just a moment to grab one out. I'm pretty sure I have it in my bag. If not, I'll find something else. Of course, it's sitting in the car. All right, well, let's grab a magazine from over here. All right. So here's how I like to show how blood vessels are made. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the magazine, I'm going to put a little piece of paper on top like this, okay? Then I'm going to take my construction paper like this. I'll put the words on the outside so you can see the outside. All right. So I don't know if you can see it, but I'm going to show the camera right there. There we go. All right, 3 layers. An inner thin layer, a thick magazine layer, we'll call it, and then an outer casing. And the 3 stack on each other. And then you fold it into a tube. There we go. That's a blood vessel, everybody. This is a blood vessel. Okay? It's got a very thin inner lining. And the inner lining is 1 cell layer thick. We call that inner lining either the endothelium or the tunica intima, which just means the internal cloth or the internal shroud. And if you look at it, it's just very thin. But then there's the middle layer. And the middle layer is much thicker. Okay? It's muscular. It's got elastic properties. It's got a little, what's called a basement layer of elastic. And the more elastic the artery, the more basement layer. You'll have a bottom layer and a top layer of elasticity to give it even more density. So you've got that intima here. The middle layer is often called the tunica media. The middle layer, the media. All right. Sometimes called the muscularis because of its muscle layer. And then the outer casing, which we see here, the outer casing, that is a more dense connective tissue, and it's often called the tunica externa, which means the outer shroud, instead of the media or the intima. Sometimes it's referred to as the adventitia because of its casing-like covering. And it doesn't matter if there's an artery, or if this is an artery, or if this is a vein. They're both built the same, with an internal layer, a middle layer, and an outer casing. Now, the artery is going to be very circular, and it's going to have a much thicker middle layer of muscle and elastic. The vein will be much flimsier, more wide open, but thinner, a much, much thinner middle layer. And then when you look at the inner layer, The intima creates these valves every so often so that any back pressure, it would block or try to prevent the backflow. Only veins have valves. And the reason why is because veins are not under pressure like arteries are. Arteries are always under pressure. The heart keeps going, it keeps beating, it keeps squeezing, it continues to maintain pressure. And the arteries are there to be built to endure that pressure to allow the blood flow to go away from the heart. Arteries never need valves. If there were valves in arteries, they would never shut because the pressure keeps pushing, 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 pushing. But the vein pressure is 1/12 that of the arteries, which means any real external pressure from muscle squeezing or anything pushing against the skin, underlying veins or whatever, it could push blood and veins the wrong way because the external pressure may be greater than the internal venous pressure. So the veins have valves that will shut against any back pressure. And when we see the lymphatic vessels, when we discuss our lymph vascular, the lymph vascular has valves also because there's not pressure pushing material through the lymph, nor is there pressure really pushing blood through the veins. All right, we rely a little bit on external muscle contractions to create external pressures to help move blood and veins. We rely on gravity to help move blood in the veins, osmolality, volume. That's what moves blood in the veins. But the arteries, it's that constant systolic squeeze of the ventricles that pushes blood in the arteries. So there's going to be a pressure. And again, arteries need to be built strong to endure that pressure. I cannot emphasize enough strength and elasticity an artery is going to need to survive your 80, 90, 100 years under constant pressure. Not veins. Veins are flimsy. Veins can collapse. Veins are bringing blood back to the heart. They're not as vital as arteries that are bringing oxygen-rich blood to the tissues of the body, at least the systemic arteries. Arteries that bring blood away from the heart going to the lungs, the blood hasn't been oxygenated yet. Those arteries have oxygen-poor blood in them. Those arteries are sending blood under pressure away from the heart to the lungs to go get oxygen-rich. So if they're drawn properly, the arteries of the lungs will be blue, and it's not until after the blood has gone through the capillaries around the alveoli that the blood will return in veins oxygen-rich. So the arteries of the lung should be blue, but the veins of the lung should be drawn red, because the systemic circuit of the body is red arteries, blue veins as we see them drawn, but the pulmonary circuit, which is heart to lungs and back to the heart, that circuit needs to be blue arteries, red veins, flip-flop from what you would believe arteries and veins to be, because the blood has not been oxygenated yet as it goes away from the heart. All right, arteries and veins. That is what we're going to focus on for the better part of this lecture. When you talk about an artery or you talk about a vein, and you see the size of the opening of its tube, we describe that space, that open space, as the lumen of the vessel, okay? So the wider the lumen, the more blood flow that can go through it. The more narrow the lumen, the lesser the amount of blood flow that can go through it, right? So sometimes vessels widen or dilate. Some people say dilatate. I am not a fan of the word said dilatate. I see the word as dilate, dilation, not dilatation, which some people say dilatation is dilatation when they say that. I prefer dilation. Now, your pupils can dilate, right? If I get closer to the light, they will do the opposite. They will constrict. But in a dark room, the pupils will dilate to allow more light. That's pupillary dilation. Maybe you've gone to the ophthalmologist and they put the drops in that caused your pupils to dilate. And then you went outside and everything seemed really bright and you got to wear those really awesome, cool, dark glasses so that you could see easier. Well, that's because the medicine that the ophthalmologists use just doesn't allow your pupils to constrict. So until the medicine wears off, you wear those dark glasses, because dilation of the pupils is to allow more light to get through to the retina. Constriction of the pupils prevents as much light from hitting the retina. Well, if you change from pupillary dilation and constriction to vessel dilation and constriction, then that's what vaso tells us. Arteries and veins both dilate and constrict That's what the middle layer of muscle does. It squeezes around the lumen for less space in constriction. It relaxes and widens to allow for more space in vascular or vasodilation. All right. Those are the terms of widening and narrowing of your blood vessel. The lumen space being big allows more blood flow through it. The lumen space being small allows less blood volume going through that vessel. When there's a lot of blood going to a tissue space, we call that hyperemia. When there's the opposite and lesser amount of blood flow goes to that tissue area, we describe that as ischemia. Now, notice the prefix hyper, and I'm going to circle that prefix. Let me get my pen going here. That's not my pen. That is the pen right there. All right, we're going to highlight the word hyper, or we're going to circle the word hyper. Hyper means too much, right? More than or too much. So what hyperemia, emia is really heme. It's really hemia. Heme means blood, okay? So hemia. The H disappears, so you just see the emia, okay? In fact, they have it drawn EMIA. It's still the root of blood, emia, okay? So when there's hyperemia, there's too much blood to the area. So if you see it to the skin becomes really red and feels warm to the touch. Hyper, as a prefix, means too much. The opposite of hyper is hypo, okay? Hypo. That means, as a prefix, not enough or too little. Less than. Less than is what it equals. Okay, it equals less than. Less than. I don't know why I wrote it out. I could have done one of these things. Less than. All right, which means that what we should be seeing are two words. Hyperemia, when there's too much blood flow because of dilation of blood vessels, or hypoemia. Hypoemia. Well, now, doesn't that sound like a speech impediment? Hyperemia, too much blood, hypoemia. If I don't know how to say my R's, I would say hypoemia. So that's why I think that they use the word ischemia instead of hypoemia, because it sounds like a speech impediment. Ischemia literally means not enough. It's too little. Not enough. Not enough. So if it's ischemic, there's not enough blood flow getting to the area because there's too much either constriction or blockage of the blood vessel, decreasing the amount of blood to the tissue. So not only will the tissue become deprived of oxygen-rich blood, say, it also becomes deprived of nutrients, and what follows is pain and discomfort, as well as inability to use the tissue. So combining, denoting suppression or deficiency. That's right. Anything that's deficient is not enough. If it's deficient, there's not enough of it. Does that make sense? So we don't say hyper and hypo when it comes to emia, because again, I'm pretty convinced that someone said, no. Hypoemia is way too much of a speech impediment. We're not going to say hypoemia. Okay. Now I'm being facetious, but honestly, it would sound really bad to say hypoemia. But we do say ischemia because that is from the Greek ischios, again, meaning deficiency or not enough, loosely translated. So too much blood, hyperemia, not enough blood, ischemia. Here's what I want you to do. Just for fun, and maybe not terribly long. All right, what I'm going to have you do, if you can find one, let's see if I have one in my immediate area. I'm going to look for a rubber band. All I can find right now is a headband. I'm looking for a rubber band because it's tighter, but I can mimic it using this headband. I'm going to take this headband and I'm going to wrap it around my finger and wrap it around my finger and wrap it around my finger and wrap it around. Okay. I want you to take a rubber band and around the base of your finger, put it on really, really tight. And then I want you to watch what happens to your finger. Make sure that the rubber band's near at the bottom, and I want you to watch what happens to your finger. Make sure you have the ability to get the rubber band off. Notice that because the rubber band's tighter and tighter and tighter around your finger, it's cutting off the blood flow to the end of your finger, right? You have created an ischemic effect. You are generating ischemia by using some external pressure, squeezing around the blood vessels, providing blood to your fingertip. As soon as you remove it, the blood is going to rush back, and it's going to go from that whitish blue color when it was ischemic to reddened, even more red than the other tissues, because as the ischemia occurred, all the vascular beyond it started to dilate to allow more blood flow to get to the tissue. And then as soon as you released that pressure and the blood immediately went into those dilated vessels, it all comes to the skin very red because all those vessels are dilated. Okay. The ischemic effect was the squeezing. You know, I used to do this when I was a kid. Just take my hand and squeeze my wrist and then get all that blood out, right? And turn my hand nice and pale and blanched. And then the little trick was is you turn a hand and you go like, and then you pull like that, and it makes it feel like you're pulling a string through your hand. Well, that's actually just a sensation of that blood rushing back to your fingers, because when you squeezed against your radial and ulnar arteries, it blocked off all the blood flow to the digital arteries. So the arteries weren't filling with blood because the pressure you created against the radial and ulnar arteries was greater than the amount of pressure that the heart can push the blood through. So you essentially created an ischemic effect. Let's say that a blood clot blocks blood vessel to your brain. We saw that as a stroke on the nervous system test. That is an ischemic event to the brain, causing damage or death to the brain tissue. If that happens to the blood vessels of the heart, the coronary vessels of the heart muscle will die. And that's an ischemic event to the heart. That's different than if a blood vessel tears and blood leaks out and then it's hemorrhagic. That's excessive bleeding. Ischemic is when you cut off the blood supply. You decrease the amount of blood flow to the area. It becomes deficient. And we never want deficiency. We want adequate. We could potentially take more than adequate, but we don't want excess, because excess can be toxic and deficiency can be problematic. So we're constantly looking for that happy medium, and that's what homeostasis does. It maintains the proper balance of what we need. Never too much, never too little. But there are times when there's too much blood flow to an area, that's hyperemic, and times when there's not enough blood flow to the area, that's ischemic. All right. So when I use the term ischemic, in your mind, visualize a lesser amount of blood getting to the area, potentially causing injury or death. If for whatever reason you hear hyperemic, which is much more common in learning techniques, when, you know, let's say that you've been doing technique and you look down and you see redness on the skin, the instructor might say, okay, we just encouraged hyperemia to the area. You know what I've noticed, a nice way to teach hyperemia is if you're wearing shorts, say, and you've got your leg one crossed over the other, and the one leg is just resting on your thigh. And after so many minutes, go ahead and remove your leg and look down immediately at your skin of your thigh, and it will get really red where your leg was. That's because the weight of your leg on your thigh was pressing against the capillaries of your skin, keeping the skin from getting a quality amount, or if you will, the right quantity of blood flow. So it was actually quite blanched and white underneath the weight of your crossed leg. But when you removed it, all those dilated capillaries fill with blood in an instant, and it becomes real red where your thigh was, or on your thigh where your leg was. And that's an example of hyperemia. We certainly know that there are massage techniques that encourage dilation of the skin, and it will make the skin look reddened. And that is the hyperemic effect of that massage technique. So, whose doesn't get red or white? Come on, really? Oh, I see what you're doing there. Yeah, it does. You just have to decide what shade of red or what shade of white you're thinking of, right? How about we could use different terms. We could use pale or rubord, which is pale is in the Latin is oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. Pallid. pallid in the Latin, and then rubor is reddened in the Latin. So sometimes you hear pallid or rubor or some form of rubro, and again, that's a type of reddening. So, all right. So hyperemia and ischemia are the terms for too much and less blood flow because of, usually a constriction or a dilation of the vessels. All right, moving on. Let's look at arteries and veins. Let's get rid of that and move on. Okay, so arteries, and this is the key, everybody. The blood is always moving away from the heart. If the blood is in arteries going to the body, that blood better be oxygenated. However, you cannot assume that every artery in your body is oxygen-rich blood, because the arteries that are leaving the right side of the heart to go to the lungs, that blood has not yet been oxygenated. The truth of an artery is that the artery is directional blood away from the heart, which means that it's always going to be under pressure, meaning that it needs to have enough quality in its strength, in its musculature, in its elasticity to be able to endure that pressure. The reason the wall is thicker and stronger is because it's under pressure. The reason it has no valves is because the blood is always moving under pressure. And it's not until the vessels get tiny, tiny, tiny that pressure gets less and less and less. Well, let's say it properly. What happens is that if you have a larger vessel that suddenly becomes smaller, you're forcing a lot of pressure through that smaller space now. It actually increases the pressure at that area. But as the vessels branch, the branching dissipates some of the push as you end up with lesser and lesser volume moving through those vessels until you eventually get to where the volume is one blood cell in a row. When you finally get down to the capillaries, the capillary lumen, the space of the capillary, is smaller in size than the size of red blood cells, which means that the red blood cells need to squeeze through the capillary spaces. So they're built and shaped for the bending and twisting and squeezing of getting through the small capillaries. It's the reason why red blood cells are not effective if they're too large. If they're too large, they can't squeeze through the capillaries, making them very ineffective, because then there's no exchange between the cells that are lining the capillaries and the oxygen of the red blood cell that's too big. So we need the right size. Again, if red blood cells were even smaller, they wouldn't carry as much oxygen. So that's not beneficial either. So all the red blood cells are the right size, the right shape, the right flexibility, if you will, to squeeze through the very small capillaries, single file, one at a time. Once you get through the capillaries, your push is gone. I mean, you ended up one, like, and think of it this way. If you've ever, I don't know if you've ever had one of those lawn, like they unfold and they look like little tubes. Maybe you have a pet that would run through them, or as little kids crawling through them. As an adult, if you try to crawl through those things, you're not going to fit very well. But the kids and the pets, the smaller pets especially, they can easily move through these long tubes. Maybe you've been in St. Louis and you've gone to the City Museum. And the City Museum's got those, 4 levels of, 4 stories, whatever, of those tiny little, the maze of tubes where kids can crawl through them and have a great time. But, if you're, as an adult, decide you want to go through there, it looked like it was that big, you're going to squeeze through it. It's going to rub your body against it and you're going to get stuck in there, or maybe not get stuck, but your claustrophobia is certainly going to come out. That's what happens with a red blood cell moving through a capillary. The red blood cell, as it squeezes through, its membrane is rubbing up against the capillary because, again, the red blood cell is bigger in size than the lumen space of the capillary. In all the other vessels, the vessels are much larger than the volume of blood, so the blood just moves through there without any, if you will, major friction against the lining of the walls of the vessel. So with all that said, if blood is moving in an artery, it can't go the wrong way, because there's so much squeeze and so much push and so much push and so much push from the ventricles out the right side of the lungs, out the left side of the body, that you're just not seeing blood going the wrong way. It's going to be pushed away from the heart. And if you push it to the lungs, that blood's going to the lungs to go get oxygenated. If you push it to the body, that blood has already been oxygenated and it's going to feed the body oxygen-rich blood. You can press against arteries. And every time the heart squeezes in systole, all that increased pressure pushes outward on the arteries. So the arteries expand. And if you happen to be pressing against an artery during that expansion, you will feel the shock wave of that blood moving through, the wave of blood moving through. And then again, and then again, and again, expansion, 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 expansion. Press against the artery, you will feel that expansion. That is what we describe as pulse, which is short for the pulsation, right? It pulsates. Your arteries pulsate under pressure because during the systolic squeeze of the ventricles, that's when pressure is greatest. That's the most expansion. And then there's a relaxing or diastole of the filling of the ventricles. And this allows the blood vessels and their elasticity to return to their shape until the next systole and then the next diastole and the next systole and the next diastole. You can watch the expansion of arteries in the body during systolic squeeze of the heart. And if you press against an artery when that happens, you will feel its pulsation. And if you want to know how many times your heart has contracted in a minute, all you need is the ability to palpate and the ability to see a clock. Because if you're watching the second hand on a clock, once it gets around a whole cycle, 60 seconds, how many times did you feel that pulsation during that 60 seconds? That is that person's pulse rate for that minute. Which again is going to be anywhere from 90 to 190, or sorry, 60 to 100 or 60 to 90. Sometimes you see sources that say 60 to 80. The lower side has a tendency to stay at 60. That's the least you expect, is at least a beat per minute or per second, excuse me. But it's typically a little bit faster. For some people, it's a lot bit faster. So they're closer to 100 beats per minute, whereas somebody else might be 60 beats per minute. Look, you don't need anything fancy to take somebody's pulse to determine how many times their heart is beating that minute. You only need palpation skills and the ability to watch a clock. Why are we doing blood pressure? What is 120 over 8? What is that? The blood pressure has nothing to do with pulse whatsoever. So the question is healthy range still 100 to 120 over 60 to 80? Nope. Nope. Blood pressure is totally different, everybody. Okay? When you hear 120 over 80, that is blood pressure. That is not pulse. Is the pressure creating the pulsation? Sure. But you're not measuring blood pressure by pushing against. Look, do me a favor. Take your fingers right now. Find your carotid pulse. Find your carotid artery in your neck. And the reason I'm having to do it in your neck is because it's a bigger artery. Okay, you feel it pulsating? Now tell me what your blood pressure is. You cannot tell your blood pressure from that, right? Does that make sense? I know, I'm just reiterating. So the point being is that in order to actually evaluate blood pressure, you would need some kind of a barometer, some kind of pressure. A barometer is to pressure what a thermometer is to temperature. A thermometer tells you how hot it is in increments, right? So the old school thermometer was mercury. And how did, was it mercury? Barometers are definitely mercury. I'm trying to remember if thermometers are also. Either way, when you would have that, you would watch the fluid inside the gauged pipette go up, right? So maybe you're old school and mom or dad had one of those old glass thermometers that were filled with the little red whatever chemical it is, and maybe you were unfortunate enough to have a rectal thermometer inserted into the rectum, and that was your temperature. That was before they came out, those little electronic things that went under your tongue, right? That measures temperature. But barometers, which is a mercury gauge, it's calibrated at sea level, in millimeters. When you add enough pressure, you watch the mercury rise in the barometer. So you have to create some kind of ability to have pressure from your arteries push into the mercury gauge. And so the way that medicine did that was they took a cuff that you could fill with air, and then the cuff pressure was pushed into the barometer gauge. And as the cuff was increased against the resistance of the arm, the pressure would go up on the barometer. And then when they let out the pressure on the barometer would go down, the cuff pressure would lessen. So what science realized was, if you increase the pressure and you watch the barometer fall, and you've got a stethoscope listening to the blood vessel, as soon as blood starts moving through the vessel again, you know the highest pressure of the blood artery, right? And then once you don't hear the sounds anymore, that's the lowest pressure of the artery. And that whole device is called a sphygmomanometer, okay? The blood pressure cuff and barometer are called a sphygmomanometer. Sphygmomanometer is how it's spelled. You'll see there's a whole slide on it. But if you don't have a blood pressure cuff and the ability to look at a dial or a barometer gauge, you cannot measure blood pressure. Pulse is not related to blood pressure. Pulse is just the expansion every time the ventricle squeezes in systole. Pulse is the squeezing of the ventricle causing the expansion of the artery. Yes, it's because of pressure, but you're not measuring pressure. So the question is how many times will that heart beat in a minute? And it's heartbeat per minute, which is known as a BPM, a beat per minute, beat per minute, beat per minute. And for hospital, if you're trying to acquire the BPM, how many beats per minute, you simply palpate and watch the clock. In most doctors' offices, the nurse or whoever's doing it will feel either the radial artery, right? Look at the clock for 15 seconds, and whatever they counted in the 15 seconds, they multiply by 4, and that's the person's per minute heart rate. It's not as accurate as going a full 60 seconds. Some will go 30 seconds and multiply by 2. I've never known anybody to go only 6 seconds and multiply by 10. But the point being is that you're palpating and using a timing device. So see if you can find some of these on you. Press where your temporal artery would be, behind your temporal vein, behind your eyebrow. Press into your skull there and see if you can feel a pulse. Try to avoid using your thumb, because some people, the artery in their thumb, if they're feeling with their thumb, they can feel their own pulse against somebody. So it's usually 1 or 2 fingers, sometimes a reinforced finger, but you're just using that so that your brain can pick up that. Most people don't actually feel their facial artery coming out in front of their parotid gland, unless there's some kind of swelling going on. The carotid artery in your neck, that's the one that the movies love to do. You know, you always watch the police officer or the paramedic go up to the person that they think might be dead, and they press 2 or 3 fingers into their carotid artery trying to feel for a pulse. I saw it last night. I was watching on PBS. I was watching a show called D.I. Ray, and the police officer is summoned because the people try to make it look like the guy overdosed, and the police officer walks up to him and then walks right and just starts pressing on his neck to determine if he's alive or dead. So the carotid artery, the axillary artery it follows the nerves into the arm. So if you find biceps brachii and then you just come up into the armpit, that same artery can be felt just above the elbow, right? As the artery changes names to the brachial artery. But most of the time, that's the one we listen to, when there's a blood pressure cuff on. But you'll palpate the radial artery. You could potentially get the ulnar artery, but the radial artery is a little bit more superficial and by the tendon. And this allows you to really feel it right there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? So that's the radial artery. And if we were to palpate in and around the femoral artery, you'd want to feel just below the inguinal ligament, where that big artery and the nerves, remember the femoral nerve, it runs in the same zone. The femoral artery, the femoral nerve, and the femoral vein are all together. So is the radial artery and the radial vein and the radial nerve. So you see, it's what we call a triad. The triad is artery, vein, and nerve all running the same pathway. Behind the knee, you can feel a pulse. With babies, when they're newborns, we do what's called APGAR scoring. And the APGAR it's just an acronym for the different levels of assessment for the newborn as far as appearance, size, weight, responses to reflexes, things like that. So there's a little set of testing, what we call APGAR scoring, that is an initial evaluation of baby, including weight and height and those other things, such that if there's lower scores, doctors can make decisions as far as, how can we get this baby healthier while they're still in our ward. So when a newborn is going through that assessment, a lot of times the nurse will press on the top of baby's foot, where the dorsalis pedis, which means the top of the foot artery, can be palpated. You think about it, babies have little tiny arms, so the radial artery is going to be a little hard to find. They're crying and they're not very happy, and so we don't really want to press into their neck, but their feet are exposed and available, so that's why the dorsalis pedis is often used. And the newborn's pulse rate is going to be considerably faster, and that one's closer to 120 beats per minute versus your 60 beats per minute at rest. So those are pulse points, which are places to palpate arteries. If you go over to other countries, they say, like parts of England or Australia, they don't learn these words as capillaries. They learn them as capillaries. Capillaries. And honestly, I don't know why there's such a difference in the pronunciation. That's the nature of dialect and things of that sort. I don't care if you call them capillaries or capillaries, as long as you know what they are. And sometimes seeing capillaries is a whole lot easier than describing capillaries. First and foremost, capillaries are the most numerous blood vessels you have. It is estimated that there are roughly 60,000 miles worth of blood vessel in your body. 60,000 miles. And that blood will circulate through more than 12,000 of those miles every minute. I don't know how that number came to be. I thought that if you've got 60,000 miles, you expect 60,000 miles worth of blood flow all the time. But I also don't know the mathematics behind how you arrive at 60,000 miles. I know I'm not a mile tall or a mile long or a mile wide, right? Okay. So what that means then is if you add up all that mileage, it's got to come from somewhere. So the way I want you to visualize it is, if you took your capillaries and you put them all in a straight line and measure the total distance of all your capillaries, that's where you get your 60,000 miles. There have been scientists that have measured the DNA of your chromosomes, and then if you stretched out all your mammalian DNA and put it in a straight line, it's the same distance as traveling to the moon and back 3.5 times in one human being, as far as the amount of DNA you have. So when you're talking microscopic, somehow they get the mathematics on, okay, if this was all in a straight line, what would it be? If you put all your vessels in a straight line, you're talking 60,000 miles, which means that if the greatest distance of any one blood vessel is, say, like your aorta, which is about 1.5 feet long. Well, 1.5 feet doesn't come close to 60,000 miles, right? There's 5,280 feet in a mile. Multiply that by 60,000. That's how many feet of arteries you'd have, or a blood vessel you'd have. So it's got to all be in the capillaries. Capillaries are basically microscopic channels, or if you will, troughs, that the cells adjacent to those capillaries are capable of feeding off of what's going through them. And what your body does is it uses your capillaries like a canal system, or if you will, oh, I know the term. Thinking of not a funneling, not a tunneling. Anyway, it'll come to me if I don't think much about it. So think about this. All right, your job is to be a farmer, and you've got your rows and rows and rows of whatever your crop is. And you want to bring water into those channels that feeds those crops. And you've got a main waterway. You have the ability to open up a channel, or if you will, open up a gate, and then the water comes in and then it trickles through all the different channels. But once there's enough water, you close off that water so that it bypasses that set of channeling, right? Shunting it other places where you want other crops to grow. And so only when those crops need the water will you open up the gate and then allow that water to, again, funnel right in. That's essentially how your capillaries work. They're not always open and filled with blood. In some cases, the arteriole that's in front of the capillaries closes off. You bypass that blood, and as long as the tissue isn't deprived of oxygen or other nutrients, it's happy where it is. Once it starts to get deprived, chemicals released from the cells basically saying, hey, we need oxygen here, we need nutrients here. Then it allows the capillary channels to open, and then that area fills with blood again until the blood is used or whatnot. So there are some capillaries that, essentially are always seeing blood flow, and there are other capillaries that are open and closed and open and closed. And this allows the right amount of blood to be delivered to the right amount of area all the time. The more vital that area is in need of blood, the more blood flow is already built to it, the more blood vessels put into it. So when you look at your liver, for example, the liver needs a constant amount of blood flow going through it because of what it does. And so when you open up the liver, it's loaded with blood vessels, especially the veins relative to other organs. Part of the nice thing about the liver is it's very regenerative, so it regenerates itself often, and it does so even with the capillaries associated with it. The reason why it's got so many veins to it is because the entire digestive tract, all the blood in the veins of the digestive organs goes to the liver first, so that the blood that's newly acquired nutrients from the digestive system, the liver can process those nutrients, detoxify those nutrients, make them more user-friendly, if you will. So you got a lot of organs in your digestive system absorbing nutrients, and we want all those nutrients available to our tissues, but we want to make sure they're user-friendly first. So the veins of the abdomen go to the liver, and it just inundates the liver with blood vessels. But that comes at a risk, because if you were to injure your liver, there's a potential that there's a lot of bleeding from those vessels, and that internal bleeding can be very, very damaging and ultimately lead to death. So you can tell that it's a very venous blood, because a bleed from the liver is a very dark blood red. So, and I'm going to show you all these vessels in a bit. So the return after blood has gone through the capillary beds is through veins. Again, veins are always bringing blood toward the heart. I don't care where the vein is. I don't care if it's a vein in the lungs. I don't care if it's a vein in the brain. I don't care if it's a vein in the heart. I don't care if it's a vein in the foot. The blood is going to go toward the heart. And because the body is returning that used blood to the heart, we often describe the venous return as oxygen poor. I think it's important to mention that when we say oxygen poor or oxygen deprived, it means that the amount of oxygen that's in that blood is not adequate, because the majority of what was adequate was used by the cells. And so there's a lesser amount of oxygen in the blood returning to the heart, and there's a greater quantity of carbon dioxide in the blood relative to what went to the tissues. So we teach it as oxygen rich or oxygen poor or oxygen rich and then carbon dioxide rich, but the reality is blood always has some amount of oxygen or some amount of carbon dioxide in it, always. Always, always, always. The question is what is the relative percentage of what is needed and adequate? When blood goes away from the left side of the heart and feeds the body oxygen-rich blood, there's still carbon dioxide in that blood, but there's a much greater, what we call partial pressure of oxygen in the blood flow going out of the left side of the heart to the tissues. Once in the tissues, the oxygen releases, and then there's a lesser amount of oxygen. It's something like 90 of a partial pressure going out, and then 10 coming back in the veins. Whereas the carbon dioxide in the blood going away from the heart is around 40, but when it returns, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45. So there's a greater partial pressure of carbon dioxide on the venous return versus the really big difference of 90 to 10 in the oxygen. That may have come across as very confusing to you, but I have ways of explaining that a little differently when we're looking at the schematic. I think the important message there is, don't get stuck thinking that there's only carbon dioxide in your blood of the veins returning to your heart. There's also oxygen, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, other things in the blood. There's just a greater amount of carbon dioxide coming back to the heart from the body than there was carbon dioxide going from the heart to the body. Likewise, when blood is enriched in oxygen in the lungs, the oxygen-rich, now enriched blood of the veins of the lungs brings that blood back to the heart, and then the left side of the heart sends that oxygen-rich blood out. Again, there's still carbon dioxide in the blood. There's just a greater partial pressure of oxygen relative to what the cells need. So when we get into breathing, we talk about inhaling and exhalation, inhalation and exhalation. We're going to be talking about how air is in the lungs. The air you're breathing right now is not pure oxygen. It's oxygen, it's nitrogen, it's carbon dioxide, it's carbon monoxide. In fact, there's more nitrogen in the air you're breathing in than there is oxygen. But when you breathe in this air, as long as that's adequate for what your cells need, it's going to be useful. And because the blood coming into the lungs has a very low partial pressure of oxygen, because there's so much of it got used by the cells, again, a partial pressure of around 10, all of that permeability goes from the lungs into the capillary to where they level out. So now you've got this delivery of oxygen because of such a big exchange in your lungs. There's still exchange of carbon dioxide between your blood and your lungs, but it's a much smaller, if you will, parabola. If you look at so oxygen exchanges like this, carbon dioxide exchanges like this, as far as the partial pressure exchange, because things that are permeable with each other, not with opposite or different gases. All right. So the veins, again, are flimsy. So they're not super thick. They collapse easily because, again, they're thinner. There's way less pressure, which is what makes them collapse easily. A larger lumen size, and they must have valves under such a less pressure to prevent the wrong direction of blood flow. So capillaries open up into venules, which are basically a way of saying very small veins, and the smaller veins open up into larger veins still, until you get to the largest of all veins that are returning blood to the heart. All right, let's take a look at them. So look at the direction of the arrow going away from the heart in a red vessel, and then this is supposed to be a capillary bed. Notice that the capillaries are smaller than the cells, and the cells, no cell that needs nutrition from the blood is too great a distance from the capillary. In fact, if cells become sequestered from capillaries, their release of chemicals in need of blood encourages what's called angiogenesis, which is where new capillaries form and connect the arterial blood flow to those cells. But not all cells stay near the capillaries. Some of them migrate away from capillaries and then they die, leaving just their extracellular matrix in their wake. And that's what we see with cartilage, which is why cartilage really doesn't regenerate, because once it's made and the cells die off, there's no new cartilage cells to reform the cartilage. And until science figures out that regenerative quality, for now, we know that there's going to be a wear and tear, a degradation of the hyaline cartilage of your joints. All right. So again, because the arrow's going away from the heart, this is an artery. As the capillaries exchange with the cells, the oxygen becomes used by the cells. The carbon dioxide created by cellular respiration is picked up by the capillaries, and then the return is back to the heart. Notice that there's twice as many veins returning blood to the heart as artery. That's going to be a kind of a common denominator. All right. Now I remember what I was going to talk about those. All right. I will make sure I talk about heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output on a different discussion. All right. So I'm going to switch gears here. And instead of looking at that kind of picture, I want to get a bunch of different pictures for you to look at and view. And for that, we're going to do artery versus vein. Artery versus vein. And the first thing I want to point out when looking at a blood vessel, looking at an artery or a vein, is, again, not the red and the blue, but the arrows. The arrows are going away from the heart. The arrows are going to the heart. Now, compare when you look at the outer casing, known as the outer layer or the adventitia, the externa, the tunica externa, it's really not much different than the outer layer of a vein. But now I want you to look at the middle muscle layer. Look at how thick compared to the veins muscle layer. Really, really thick. And then the inner layer, being one cell layer thick, the intima, is the same, only it's a little bit wider here. And look at those valves created by the intima. They're very flimsy valves, they're very small valves, but they're valves nonetheless. And when you have enough of them, you can prevent enough backflow to not cause problems, hopefully. By the way, as vessels get smaller and smaller, the layers start disappearing until ultimately you're left with just the innermost layer as a capillary. The capillary is one cell layer thick, not much different than the inner lining of these blood vessels, which is one cell layer thick. Again, if you measure the muscular middle of the artery, it's thicker than the muscular middle of the vein. If you look at the lumen size, it's very circular concentric, and it's narrowed versus the widened, flimsy vein, which again has these valves. And the valves look a lot like semilunar valves of the heart, but microscopic versions of them in some veins. I wouldn't say microscopic, but single cell flaps, if you will, rather than big, thick valves. But if you look at the externa, the external adventitia, the outer casing, it's pretty much the same. Really, the big difference is the middle layer and the valves. An artery, muscular center, elastic basement membrane, smaller narrow lumen. The blood flow goes into the arteriole, and then once it's through the arteriole, let's say that there's muscles called sphincter muscles around the outside of the beginning of the capillary here. If those are tight and closed, the blood's just going to go through this meta-arteriole until it gets to the venous return. But if those sphincter muscles open, they're called arterial, no, not arterial sphincters. They're called, let's see if I see one. The sphincter has a name. It is I'm going to find it now. Well, that's a weird look. That's a valve in a vein. You never need a valve in an artery. And there's an artery under a microscope. There's a vein under a microscope. Very flimsy and wide, very muscular and narrow. Usually with a picture like this, I see the sphincter. And they're right here on the channel. This is, the blood will go through it. If it's open, blood fills the capillary. If it's closed, then blood does not fill the capillary. But look at this. We got the inner basement membrane of elasticity. We got an outer basement membrane of elasticity. We've got the thick muscular middle, the very thin concentric inner layer. But really, the outer casing is basically the same. It may just be a capillary sphincter, but I thought that there was a term. Let's see if I can find it. That's the beginning of the aorta. This is the coronary artery. Coronary, see the shape of the heart? And then as blood goes up the arch. That's a real slide. A real artery. Look at the intima, the muscular media, the adventitia, the externa, versus the very flimsy but thin intima, a little bit of the musculature of the media, the adventitia or the externa, and the very flimsiness of the vein. Thick muscular middle of the artery, no valves. Thin muscular middle of the vein, valves. I am still looking for that. Let's try it this way. Capillary sphincters. If you look on the arteriole, you can see it's surrounded by smooth muscle. And then there's a sphincter right there. A sphincter right there, sphincter right there. Precapillary sphincters. Precapillary, which means it's the sphincter before the blood can go in the capillary. If those are tight and they squeeze against the capillary vessel, no blood will go into the capillary. It'll stay in the meta-arteriole and then just go right into the venous return. There they are. Precapillary and postcapillary. Precapillary sphincters, postcapillary venules. That's after the capillary of the venule. So there, this is what I was wanting to show. These are just basically little tiny smooth muscle cells that wrap around the beginning of the capillary. Should they be squeezed, blood will not go into the capillary. But should they relax, blood can fill into the capillary. And if blood fills into the capillary, there are cells all around the capillaries that will then get the advantage of the blood. Any blood that goes through the capillary eventually collects into the venules and is on the way to veins getting bigger and bigger going back to the heart. This is a great example of a closed capillary. So the smooth muscle around the arteriole can dilate, allowing blood to come into the meta-arteriole. If these sphincter capillaries don't, or capillary sphincters don't relax, the capillaries will stay shut. Blood will just go through the central, what's called a meta-arteriole. A little of it gets exchanged. The rest of it just continues on to the venous return. But should those be relaxed and open, all of the capillary will fill with blood. Blood cells in a single file. And there, what a great look of the arteriole and the capillary with a sphincter muscle wrapped around it. So precapillary was what I was looking for the name of the sphincter. Here they're open, blood is in the capillaries. Here they're closed, blood is not in the capillaries. And that allows a bypass of the tissue. So I'm still at odds, or my brain is not wanting to come up with the type of farming where you channel water. Huh. Feel like I got enough sleep last night. Oh, there. It's another good. So blood flows in the capillary now because the sphincters are relaxed. Blood flow is out of the capillaries because the sphincters are contracted. Cultivation. What is the damn word? Okay. Whew, it'll come to me. I promise it'll come to me. All right. So vasomotion or vasomotor is just the squeezing and dilating of blood vessels to encourage blood flow, more or less. Dilated blood flow or dilated vessels, more blood, constricted vessels, less blood. But this is an example of the capillaries. The capillaries are between the smallest arterioles and then the venules. And once the blood's in the venules, it's going to start to return through the venules in the larger veins and even larger veins, and eventually the largest veins that bring blood back to the heart. So let's actually take a look here at blood flow in capillaries. I like watching blood flow in capillaries. I don't know why. I've always thought it was cool. They usually have cameras on like frog blood vessels, and you're able to see the blood cells moving through these capillaries, capillary blood flow. So here's more of a schematic first, and then I'm going to show you stuff like this, where we can actually see real blood cells moving through real capillaries. Single file. Those are a little on the big side, but you know, you can see that there's a much lesser. I mean, look, they're squeezing one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. So pretty impressive. Let me show you this one first. So what it was showing was when there was constriction of the vessel, lesser blood flow went into the capillaries, and then when there was dilation, more blood flow went in the capillaries. So here's vasodilation versus vasoconstriction.
Vessels transport nutrients to organs or tissues and to transport wastes away from organs or tissues in the blood. Vasoconstriction is the narrowing of blood vessels, typically when the muscles of blood vessel walls become constricted, causing the vessel lumen to become smaller. Vasoconstriction can be a reaction to cold, stress, cigarette smoking, and medications. And when blood vessels in your body widen, allowing more blood to flow through them and lowering your blood pressure. Vasodilation occurs naturally in response to low oxygen levels or increases in body temperature. Its purpose is to increase blood flow and oxygen delivery to parts of the body that need it most.
All right, let's watch some blood cells moving through blood vessels.
Oh gosh! Oh my gosh! Come on! Oh my gosh!
So that one had some capillary blood flow. Let's see.
Our red blood cells make up
So that is blood moving through capillaries. Let's find more of those. So here you can see them single file almost, and then entering a larger venule where it's a little bit more congested. You can see some of the smaller ones in the distance down at the bottom. Look, if you ever see it moving slowly, it's got to be a vein or a venule. Okay, if you ever see it just whirring by, it's some arterial under pressure. And it looks like this is probably frog. This is inside of fish. So that was inside of a fish's tail, or different fish tail views. This is kind of an imaginary one. And let's see. Here we go, inside of a frog. Take a look up at the top, how it's much faster out of this vessel, right? Again, when you see stuff coming in, what you have an overlap vessel, you got some going one way, some going another way, right? So you've got an arterial side and you've got a venous side. You know, the slower stuff coming toward the larger vessels is venous. The real fast stuff going out, that's sometimes whirring by, that's under pressure. So that's an arterial. And they're side by side there. So pretty cool. All right, that's all for that. So let's take a look at arteries. That's all of it. So I may come back to that one. I don't remember. I know it says Swedish, but I don't remember how much English is on that. I think it's all right. Right now I'm focusing on arteries. What are arteries? It's a good one actually, but that's multiple videos. It's a site. There's a stent in an artery. Arteries getting clogged. Major arteries of the body. Arteries versus veins. That's probably not a bad thing to show. All right, that's what we'll do then. We'll start with this.
Did you know that if you took all the blood vessels in our body and laid them out end to end, they would measure about 100,000 kilometres? That's enough to wrap around the Earth 2.5 times. But what exactly does it take to make a blood vessel? Let's find out now as we explore the microanatomy of blood vessels. In this tutorial, we'll learn all about the microanatomy of the two major types of blood vessels, arteries and veins. When talking about these vessels, we'll pay particular attention to their wall structure and thickness. We will see that both arteries and veins share a common structural arrangement formed by 3 layers: the tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. We'll investigate how their structure is related to their function. We will also, of course, compare the composition of these layers in both types of vessels. Once we've covered all of that, we'll conclude, as always, with a clinical note. But firstly, what is the circulatory system? Before we jump right into the deep end, however, let's have a little recap on the circulatory system. The circulatory system is your very own biological delivery service. It functions to deliver oxygen, nutrients, and hormones to cells across the entire body, whilst simultaneously removing any unwanted waste products to other parts of the body for disposal. Through a network of arteries and veins of varying sizes, which are interconnected by capillaries, blood is carried around to all the tissues in the body. Arteries are defined as vessels bringing blood away from the heart. In the systemic circuit, arteries carry oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood towards various organs and tissues of the body. The exception to this is the pulmonary circulation, where arteries carry deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. There are 3 types of arteries in the body: elastic arteries, muscular arteries, and arterioles. Veins, in contrast, carry blood away from the rest of the body and towards the heart. One exception is the portal vein, which carries blood from the gastrointestinal tract to the liver. In the systemic circuit, veins carry deoxygenated blood, while in the pulmonary circulation, pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Their structure is not as varied as that of arteries, and they are generally just categorized by size into small, medium, and large veins. Except for their smallest examples, all arteries and veins consist of 3 concentric layers, called tunicae. From innermost to outermost, they are the tunica intima, the tunica media, and finally, the tunica externa, which you can see in these illustrations.
This video is not over yet. Continue watching now the full video at kenhub.com. We have lots more videos like this one available to our
Did you know that if you took all
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that picture of the veins and the arteries there. Okay. So again, the intima is 1 cell layer, thin. Here it is nice and circular because of the thick middle layer of the artery. Here it is thin with the valves, which you never need in an artery. And then again, a thick muscular middle relative to the thinner muscular middle. But the outer casing or the external is basically the same. Look, I want you to notice something about the blood vessel. It's got smaller blood vessels to it. No different than the heart, having to feed itself from the inside out. So it feeds the outer part of itself so that it can allow blood to go through it. Blood vessels that are big have to have smaller vessels that bring blood to its outside to feed the muscles of the vessel, right? because this is essentially an organ. And it's got a lot of cells that rely on blood. But the blood going through the vessels is moving through too fast. So the smaller vessels allow the dissemination of the useful blood to the outer parameters of that vessel so that the vessel can still function as a conduit for moving blood. So I think that's really cool that you're able to see nerves to tell the muscle or to tell the vessel when to constrict or dilate, arteries to bring oxygen-rich blood to the vessel. Okay. Veins to bring oxygen poor, remove oxygen-used blood away from the vessel. And as you look in the lungs, right, and you look at the arteries and the veins, the vasculature is still the same. But what you have is vessels from the venous side supplying oxygen-rich blood to the tissue, and then those arterioles getting it back into the stream to get it to where it can go into the lungs. So it still flip-flops in the lungs regardless. All right. So those are arteries versus veins. And now, again, I want to really understand the capillary. And what I want you to see this time, instead of blood moving through the capillary, the actual exchange that occurs when material is in the capillary exchanging with the cells. Capillary exchange is what we call it. And it ultimately is a discussion of what's called bulk flow. As long as we have a constant flow of material coming into the capillaries, there can be exchange with the tissues. It's referred to as capillary tissue exchange. See it? Capillary exchange. And you've got stuff coming out and stuff going in. Dr. Mike, as long as he doesn't have his crazy mustache, usually explains things pretty well. My wife enjoys his lectures. He works with another named Eric, Dr. Eric. Or no, sorry, Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike. Capillary exchange, this is a computer talking, I'm pretty sure, if I remember right. But it's a simple schematic, and that's what I like to see, because the more complex you get with the exchange, the harder it is to visualize. So let's start with the simple first, and then we'll get a little bit more detailed.
Capillaries are thin-walled blood vessels with an arterial and venous end. Their thin walls and narrow diameter are optimal for the exchange of fluid, gases, nutrients, and waste between blood and tissues of the body. This process is called capillary exchange. In general, fluid moves out of capillaries at their arterial ends. Most, but not all, of that fluid re-enters at their venous ends. The forces that drive fluid and its dissolved contents into and out of capillaries are net hydrostatic pressure, which is the difference between blood and interstitial fluid pressures, and oncotic pressure, which is the difference between blood and interstitial colloid osmotic pressures. Net filtration pressure is the difference between net hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure. This regulates the inward and outward movement of fluid at each end of the capillary. At the arterial end of the capillary, a positive net filtration pressure favors movement of fluid from the blood into the interstitial space. For example, the difference between a net hydrostatic pressure of 33 millimeters mercury and an oncotic pressure of 20 millimeters mercury results in a net filtration pressure of 13 millimeters mercury that forces fluid out of the capillary. The shift from filtration to reabsorption at the venous end of the capillary is due to a lower capillary blood or hydrostatic pressure. Here, the difference between a net hydrostatic pressure of 13 millimeters mercury and an oncotic pressure of 20 millimeters mercury results in a net filtration pressure of negative 7 millimeters mercury. This negative net filtration pressure forces fluid from the interstitial space back into the capillary. Approximately 90% of the fluid that leaves the blood capillary at its arterial end will re-enter at its venous end. Lymphatic capillaries capture the remaining 10% of the fluid. Fluid in the lymphatic system is eventually returned to the bloodstream. This table summarizes the forces that influence the fluid exchange at the arterial and venous ends of a capillary.
All right, so we're going to try to make more sense. I don't remember if this bulk flow discussion is any good, but
It's time for me to get set up for
So I don't remember if this video explains the bulk flow a little bit more detailed or not, so I'm going to give it a try before I go back to one of the others.
Therapy, and I use this room as my office, but the desk is over here, and so
with bulk flow, fluids will leave a capillary because of pressure, not because of diffusion or penocytosis. The blood hydrostatic pressure, or BHP, is an outward pushing force, which will force fluid through the spaces between the endothelial cells lining the capillaries. Small molecules may leave with the fluid and thus leave the capillary. So gases, glucose, amino acids, etc. may travel with the water. Larger substances, such as blood proteins and blood cells, cannot pass through these spaces. So with bulk flow, pressure pushes materials from a capillary. At the arterial end of a capillary, the blood hydrostatic pressure, which is the outward pushing force, exceeds the pressure of the osmotic pressure, the blood colloid osmotic pressure, or BCOP, which is an inward pushing force. Because the outward pushing force exceeds the inward pushing force, there is a net pressure which will force fluid and materials out of the capillary. And this is the situation which exists at the arterial end of a capillary. At the venial end of the capillary, the blood pressure has been reduced. As a result, the osmotic pressure, the blood colloid osmotic pressure, the inward force, exceeds the blood pressure, which is the outward force. Because of this, the net pressure is that of an inward force, which returns fluid to the capillary, bringing materials with it. This is what occurs at the venial end of the capillary.
All right. So let's get a final explanation of that exchange. And I think this was pretty decent.
The capillaries permit the exchange of nutrients and wastes between the blood and tissue cells. Capillary exchange occurs via three basic mechanisms: diffusion, transcytosis, and bulk flow. The most important method of capillary exchange is diffusion. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, and other lipid-soluble substances pass through endothelial cell membranes. Glucose, amino acids, and other water-soluble substances diffuse through intercellular clefts and fenestrations. Transcytosis.
All right. So what he's saying is, you see these little pores in the cell lining of the capillary? If there's more outside than there is inside, the stuff that's out is going to diffuse inward to where they equal. If there's more inside than where's outside, the stuff that's inside will diffuse outward to where they're equal. Diffusion's always about going from where there's more to where there's less to try to equal out for an equal disbursement. And it's a very passive thing because capillary cells are fenestrated, or if you will, porous. Smaller molecules that can fit through the space easily leak out. So think of one of those garden hoses that has little piercings in it. So you get a little bit of water that just kind of comes out in your garden. It's not a lot, it's just a little bit squirting out. And that's because there's a lot of water in the hose and not much out, and they can squeeze through, the water can squeeze through those small holes. Well, if that garden hose was inside of like a really, really salty container or tub of like a bucket of salt water, and you had like filtered non-salt water going through the hose, you'd actually have some of that salt pull into the hose because there's more salt in the bucket than there is in the hose. That's kind of an example of the cells getting rid of their waste and getting picked up by the hose. But if the hose had salt water and the bucket had unsalted water, well, as the water comes out of the hose, once the level of the salt water in the bucket is equal to that in the hose, then you won't get any more diffusion, because you're going to get all the salt it's in the water of the hose that's coming out until there's an equal amount. It originally goes from high concentration to low concentration until it equals. Because of the way cells work, you're almost always seeing some kind of usage removal. So the levels, or the, if you will, the concentrations of these things change from outside to inside regularly. So as long as there's pores or cracks, if you will, between the cells, spaces for the small molecules to fit through, diffusion is a simple way to get material into and out of the capillary. That's what they're saying so far.
Is used to move small amounts of large lipid-insoluble molecules, such as large proteins, across capillary membranes. In this process, substances contained in vesicles enter endothelial cells by endocytosis and exit by exocytosis. Bulk flow is the movement.
All right, so imagine, if you will, that there's enough material collecting against a cell of the capillary. The membrane of the capillary may encase that and surround it. It uses a little bit of a molecular interaction of energy molecule of ATP to create this sac. And then the ATP starts allowing motor proteins called dyneins to grab the vesicle and start pulling the vesicle through the inner lining of the cell. So it's referred to as endocytosis. It's a way to essentially, like, pretend for a moment that my hand here, let's see, make sure I can see myself here so I know the camera's at least on it. All right, so my hand here is the membrane of the capillary cell lining, okay? Or even the cell adjacent to the capillary that's trying to pull the stuff in. And let's say this is the material, these 3 pennies, okay? These 3 pennies now would embed into the membrane, and essentially the membrane would case in and form a vesicle, fluid filled with the pennies inside, and that would get pulled into the membrane of the cell, where motor proteins would grab that and along the microtubules bring that inside the cell. It's keeping the pennies inside of the vesicle. And once the vesicle gets to the membrane on the other side of whatever cell's next, if it's a transfer, for example, they'll fuse, and then the pennies will be basically removed from one vesicle and put into the next. It's a process of transportation that's called endocytosis if it's going into a cell, or exocytosis if it's going out of a cell. But it is not as, it's not passive. It requires that ATP usage with the motor proteins. But it's one of the qualities of a cell membrane that the vesicle membrane is the same as a cell membrane, but it keeps the material encased to that vesicle. So that's what it was showing there. That is not that, it does happen with larger molecules, but if you really want to see exchange between the capillary and the tissues, then you want to see bulk flow, which is the next part.
Movement of large volumes of ions, molecules, or particles between blood and interstitial fluid. The movement occurs when a pressure gradient pushes water and dissolved solutes out of or into the capillary. Bulk flow is always from an area of high pressure to an area of lower pressure, and continues as long as pressure differences exist. Substances in the flow move in unison across fenestrations and intercellular clefts. Fenestrated capillaries allow more bulk flow than continuous capillaries. Tight junctions at the intercellular clefts of continuous capillaries allow little bulk flow. Most solutes can cross with water. However, most larger proteins and formed elements in the blood, such as red blood cells, cannot pass through the fenestrations of the endothelial cell. Bulk flow
Let's see. This is just okay. So again, as the pressure comes in, especially in places where capillaries are more, if you will, have greater slits, and this is really more of the true nature of that garden hose that's full of the fenestrations. That's basically a lot of pressure, right? That's not true diffusion. You know, when I put the hose into that bucket of water, that's diffusion. But if you just have a garden hose where a little bit spraying out of the holes, that's the nature of bulk flow. There's a lot of pressure of water inside the hose. There's those small little gaps that the pressure can push from the high to the low, and it allows the water to squirt out in that type of manner. So this video is basically talking about factors that affect bulk flow, and ultimately it's about how much is coming out to how much is coming in. And I'm never going to test you on bulk flow. I'm not going to test you on capillaries. All I want you to know is that exchange between the cells of the body and the blood of the body's vessels is in these capillaries. So we'll watch this final factors that influence bulk flow, and then we'll move on to summarizing our vessels.
Plays an important role in regulating the relative volumes of blood and interstitial fluid. It does this by balancing specific pressures. Bulk flow is given two names, depending on the direction of movement. There are four factors that determine the net direction of capillary exchange. Blood hydrostatic pressure, generated by the pumping of the heart, promotes filtration by pushing fluid out of the capillary. Blood colloid osmotic pressure is caused by the colloidal suspension of plasma proteins that are too large to pass through fenestrations or gaps between endothelial cells.
So what he's saying is that as blood moves out and it changes the concentration of the blood, the albumin and the other suspension proteins allow the pressure to be different as far as versus the hydrostatic pressure. It's more of that colloidal oncotic pressure. So it's because of what's too large in the plasma, those plasma proteins that I mentioned, albumin, for example, that creates a bit of a suspension. And I had mentioned when I was talking plasma in an earlier lecture that that's really what allows this big exchange to occur between what's in the plasma and what's in the cells.
This pressure acts as if it pulls fluid into the capillary and promotes reabsorption. Blood hydrostatic pressure combines with interstitial fluid osmotic pressure, the slight pull of fluids towards the interstitium, to promote filtration. In opposition, blood colloid osmotic pressure and interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, which is near zero under normal conditions, promote reabsorption. The balance of the filtration and reabsorption forces, called net filtration pressure, determines whether blood volume remains steady or changes. At the arterial end of the capillary, filtration pressures are stronger by 10 millimeters of mercury. At the venous end, reabsorption pressures are stronger by 9 millimeters of mercury. As these typical pressures illustrate, about 90% of the fluid volume that is filtered out of the capillary is reabsorbed. The remainder drains into lymphatic capillaries to form lymph. An abnormal buildup of interstitial fluid results in swelling, known as edema. Edema is a symptom of increased blood hydrostatic pressure, or capillary permeability, decreased blood colloid osmotic pressure, or a problem with normal lymphatic drainage. Blood moves through vessels at a rate that is inversely related to total cross-sectional area. For example, capillaries, when all of them are added together, have a higher cross-sectional area than arteries and veins. Therefore, blood flows more slowly through capillaries. Slower blood velocity in the capillaries allows more time for the exchange of materials. Arteries and veins have lower total cross-sectional areas, so blood velocity is greater. Blood velocity slows as blood travels away from the heart and increases as blood leaves capillaries and returns to the heart.
That's the story of how arteries and veins work relative to capillaries. All right. So now I want you to see typical pictures of arteries and veins. Arteries and veins. Instead of arteries versus veins, let's do arteries and veins and see what happens. Oh, that's what happens. We see these types of pictures. This is an example of the vessels of your body. It is just one example of many. The branching is quite a bit more involved and intricate than what you're seeing here, but these are what we call the major vessels. And if we start at the heart and we come out of the heart, we have the aorta. And once you come out of the aorta, the very first vessels off the aorta are actually coming around to the outside of the heart itself. And those are the coronary vessels. And then as we follow the aorta up into the first branch at the top of the arch, we have what's called the brachiocephalic trunk, which is part cephalic, which means headward, and part brachial, which means armward. It will split into the subclavian vein on the, or excuse me, subclavian artery on the right, and the common carotid on the right. The common carotid is going to go up to the brain and the face and the scalp, because the internal part goes to the brain and the external part goes to the scalp. The brachial artery eventually will form from the subclavian artery. A branch of subclavian comes to form the vertebral artery, and then the subclavian artery comes out under the clavicle. When it enters the armpit, it changes the name to axillary artery. It's the same artery, it just changes names in the armpit. And then when it enters the arm, it changes names again to the brachial artery, and at the elbow it will split. The radial artery will go parallel to the radius, the ulnar artery will run parallel to the ulna, and it will give off branches both to the front and back of the hand that give off arteries to the fingers and thumb. The arches, the dorsal and palmar arches, give off digital arteries to each of the digits, including the thumb. So again, if you're a blood cell that comes out of the left ventricle, you'll go into this aorta, into this brachiocephalic trunk, maybe into the subclavian artery, into the axillary artery, into the brachial artery, into the radial artery, and eventually make it to the thumb. Let's just say that that's where you get into a capillary and exchange your oxygen. Then the venous return comes through either the radial vein, or maybe the ulnar vein, or maybe the basilic vein, or maybe the cephalic vein, or maybe it goes into the brachial vein, or maybe it goes through the it's usually one of those three in the arm. It's either going to be the basilic vein, which is this the difference between basilic and the ulnar is basilic is very superficial. It stays along the skin side all the way up into the armpit. The ulnar vein is deeper, and it comes and it meets in the middle with the radial vein to form what's called the brachial vein, which again is deep, running with this brachial artery. But the cephalic vein comes off of the wrist on the thumb side, and it stays deeper, basically. And that's the whole thing with what you can't tell with looking at pictures like this. You can't tell what are deeper veins and what are superficial veins. But notice there's only one big artery in the arm, but there are two veins. There's really three veins in the arm, right? The big brachial vein, which is deep, running with the artery, and the superficial basilic vein and the superficial cephalic vein. I want you to look at your own arm and look at your biceps and see if you can see that vein running right over the top of your biceps. That's what this cephalic vein is right here. If you've ever had blood drawn, blood is usually drawn somewhere here in the cubital fossa, where they're either getting onto a tributary of the cephalic vein, the connecting of the cubital vein to the basilic vein, or maybe even the inner part of the basilic vein, depending on how the phlebotomist wanted to draw blood. If you don't go into the right arm, you may go up into the neck. You may go through the carotid artery. This is common before it splits internal or external. You may end up in the brain. You may end up in the face, right? Skin, tongue, facial muscles, chewing muscles, wherever you end up. But that's through the arteries that are either the carotid, internal or external, or the vertebral artery. When you return from the brain, the return from the brain will be through, let's say you're in the brain The veins of the brain will bring you up to one of the sinuses. Then the sinuses will bring you back to the internal jugular. And then from the internal jugular, you'll come back to the superior vena cava. Well, first internal jugular in a subclavian vein, and then internal superior vena cava. But if you're in the face or scalp, you'll return through the external jugular to the subclavian vein, and from the subclavian vein into the superior vena cava. So let's say that you ended up into the second branch of the aorta, the arch. Well, then you're going to go to the left side of the head, face, or neck, or whatever. If you continue, you might end up into the left arm. But maybe you stay in the aorta and you come down and you branch to one of the many abdominal organs. And what's nice about the branches of the aorta in the abdomen is the branches are named for the organs they go to. So the splenic artery goes to the spleen. The hepatic artery goes to the liver. The renal artery to the kidney. The enteric arteries to the intestines. The gastric arteries, or if you will, the celiac arteries to the stomach. So if you know what the translations are, the medical terminology, if you will, for the organs of the abdomen, the arteries take you pretty much right into the center of the organ, and then they have their own arterial and venous system inside their network. But if you stay in the aorta all the way till you get to the ilium level, then you're going to split into either well, first it's called the common iliac artery, but then you'll either go internal toward the groin or stay external toward the thigh. And once you enter the thigh, you're in the femoral artery. And then the femoral artery at the knee has an anterior tibial branch, has a posterior tibial branch, and has a fibular or peroneal branch. So the peroneal artery runs along the peroneus muscles on its underside. And then the anterior tibial artery runs underneath tibialis anterior along the bone edge. And the posterior tibial artery runs with the tibial nerve all the way down the back of the leg, goes into the bottom of the foot and becomes the plantar arteries, which eventually form, the plantar arch. And then these others form the dorsal arches, and the arches give off your digital arteries to your toes. And when blood goes to return, it can either return through this long saphenous vein, which is superficial, or it can go through the anterior tibial vein or the posterior tibial vein or the peroneal veins. And eventually, you'll either be in the superficial femoral or the deep femoral veins, which all come together with the saphenous vein at the external iliac vein. And then the external iliac vein joins with the internal iliac vein, and now you've got the inferior vena cava bringing blood back to the heart. So that was a real quick explanation of arteries. What I'd like to do when I see you with our class on Saturday is to actually look at all those arteries and veins, just following the blood, looking at the arteries and seeing where they change names and all that. And then we can transition from our arteries and our veins into our discussion of the lymph vascular system, the lymphatics. So if you want to get a little bit of a head start, what I would encourage you to do is go online. All right, let me share the screen again. Okay. Or, you can look in the book, because the book actually has arteries and veins. But if you do, what you want to do is you want to do artery diagram. Okay, artery diagram. And when you see an artery diagram, it allows you, like this one, it allows you to, come on, let me highlight it. There you go. This one's more in quiz form, but it allows you to see just the arteries. And then you can see, okay, what is this artery? What is that? And this one's actually the same one as the one I just showed you from the same, there, that's good. And is that one from the book, or is that one? Yeah, because that looks like the book's version. Yeah. So those are Google images. Okay. But that's exactly what I want you to do, because what I want you to is when you look at the diagram of it, right? And like the one I showed you was combined, but if you do them individually, like Ina's that she just put on there, like for example, if this is just the arm, it allows you to see, where is it called subclavian? Where is it called axillary? Where is it called brachial? Why is that radial? Why is that all? You see, this doesn't make sense. And in a lot of cases, it's relative to the bone or the region, like the radial side, the ulnar side. And even though, like, for those of you in Illinois, right? Maybe you've been on Lincoln Trail, which became Lincoln Highway, which became Highway 50, right? I mean, you never got off the road. It just changed names, right? It's just the nature of the artery. Come on. When you can look at a picture like this and then see those words, and if it makes sense, okay, that's brachial and that's radial and that's ulnar. This is a very simplistic view of arteries, the one I have on the screen. The one in the neck is the common carotid. The one in the arm goes from subclavian to axillary to brachial. Along the thumb side is radial, pinky side ulnar. This is the aorta again, splitting. That's the common iliac. Then it splits into the external iliac, which then becomes the femoral artery. And then again, if it's running down the front of the tibia, it's anterior. The back of the tibia is posterior. If it's running along the fibula, it's fibular or peroneal. So it's not the most challenging thing to identify. Look, if we got into the real meticulous nature of arteries, and I said, okay, here's the basilar artery on the underside of the brainstem and its branches, and here's the circle of Willis, and here's the cerebral artery. Yeah, that gets a little bit more detailed. Anytime you go from bigger arteries to smaller arteries, it becomes more detailed. But if there's one thing to say about the arteries and veins, is that you can find a lot of variations of the way blood vessels pattern. So we always focus on the major vessels first, and then the branching pattern again can be variable, but we go from there. So when I have the picture on the test, for example, I'm just going to have one picture of the arteries and one picture of the veins, right? With lines going to them. And most of them are it's not much different than knowing the bones. So don't let identifying arteries and veins freak you out. They are only going to be the arteries and the veins of the body, not the lungs. So the red and the blue will help you as far as going, okay, I know the red ones are arteries because they're the body's arteries, and the blue ones are the veins because they're the body's veins. All right. That's all I have for you for today. Have a wonderful 4th of July. No class Thursday. I will see you at 3 p.m. on Saturday. That's the 6th of July. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Goodbye.